Some stories are better heard with someone else. But you're here alone. Welcome to Don't Listen Alone. This is 100% ad-free, just you and whatever comes next. Drop your location and the time before we begin. Now, listen carefully. Not everything you hear is part of the story. Everyone knows that when a beloved pet dies, something of them stays behind. It may be a memory, a habit, a sound you think you still hear, or the feeling that they are somehow still near you. A good pet does not just live in your home. It becomes part of your everyday life, part of your family, and part of your heart. After they are gone, their absence sits in the house like an empty chair. You keep expecting to see them in the yard, by the door, or under the kitchen table. You miss the simple things most, the things you never thought about while they were still alive. The sound of their feet, the way they looked at you, the comfort of knowing they were close by. And sometimes, if you are lucky, or maybe blessed, you begin to wonder if love is stronger than death. You begin to wonder if a faithful animal might still stay close enough to protect you. That is something I have thought about many times, and not just because of one moment, but because of several. Over the years, I have come to believe that animals often know more than we do. They see things we cannot see, feel things we cannot feel, and react to danger long before we understand that danger is even there. I learned this as a child, and then I learned it again as an adult in a much more personal and powerful way. Looking back now, it feels as though these experiences were connected by one simple truth. The animals that loved us were watching over us, in life and perhaps even after death. When my husband and I decided to move out to a farm in southeastern Ohio, it felt like the right kind of place to raise children. There was room to run, room to play, room for noise, and room for animals. A farm is not just a place where people live. It is a place that breathes in a different way. There are fields, fences, roads that seem to stretch forever, and a kind of silence at night that you do not get in a city, or even in a small town. The kids wanted a dog, and of course, on a farm, a dog seemed like a natural part of family life. Over the years while the children were growing up, we had 3 outside dogs. Each one had its own personality, its own habits, and its own place in the family, but the last dog we had was special. His name was Lucky. He got that name because our son picked him out from a litter of 12 puppies. Out of all those little pups tumbling over each other, our son chose him, and from that day on, Lucky was part of us. Some animals become pets. Others become companions in the truest sense of the word. Lucky was one of those. He could not have been a better friend to our son and daughter while they were growing up. He was faithful, loving, and strong in that quiet way good dogs often are. He was a protector too. He knew our voices, our steps, our moods, and the shape of our lives. He loved all of us, and each of us loved him back in our own way. When children are young, a family dog belongs to the whole house, but especially to them. Lucky ran with them, watched them, stayed near them, and became part of their growing up years. There is something beautiful about a child and a dog growing up together. They become woven into each other's memories. A dog does not judge, does not hold grudges the way people do, and does not stop loving because the day was hard. Lucky was that kind of dog. He was steady. He was good. He was always there. Then, as life always does, things changed. The children grew older and eventually left for college. The house became quieter. The noise of their laughter, their fighting, their shoes by the door, their coming and going slowly became memories instead of daily life. It is strange how a home changes when children leave. Even if it is still full of furniture and routine, something softer disappears. In those quieter years, Lucky became my companion more than ever. He was there with me in the mornings, in the evenings, in those ordinary hours when no one thinks they are making memories. He was there in the yard, by the porch, near the house, always part of the shape of the day. A dog can become a comfort in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has never had one. Their presence alone can make you feel less lonely. That is why it broke my heart when he became sick. It happened before his 8th birthday. For a dog that had become so important to our family, it felt too soon. It always feels too soon. but with him it felt especially unfair. He had been such a faithful part of our lives that I think I had quietly imagined he would somehow keep going forever. Of course, life does not work that way. He took sick, and then he was gone. I cried for days. I missed him terribly. I missed his bark, his way of looking at us, the sight of him in the yard. I missed the simple comfort of knowing he was there. The farm felt different without him. It felt emptier. And yet, even after he died, there were times when I still felt him near. At first, those feelings were soft and hard to explain. A sense of him being close, a brief impression, the kind of thing you might call memory if you wanted to stay practical. But one night, something happened that changed that feeling into certainty for me. I had been feeling sick on and off for several days. It was not one of those quick illnesses that comes and goes. It was more like an uneasy weakness, a heaviness in my body that I could not quite explain. My husband was away driving truck, so I was alone in the house that night. The house always felt different when he was gone. The same rooms, the same walls, the same furniture, but the silence sat more heavily when there was no one else there. I remember going upstairs to bed, tired and wanting rest more than anything. I fell asleep, and then sometime later I heard Lucky barking. I knew that bark. A dog's bark is like a voice to the people who love it. You know when it is playful, when it is warning, when it is angry, and when it is trying to get your attention. In my sleepiness, hearing that bark filled me first with joy. For a second, before my thoughts fully woke, I felt so happy to hear my old friend again. It was like having him back. But then the truth came rushing in. Lucky was dead. He had already died. How could he be barking? By then I was fully awake. I turned on the light, and immediately I knew something was wrong. I felt sick, but not in the same way as before. It was stranger now, heavier, almost unreal. I managed to get downstairs, and as I moved through the house, the truth hit me all at once. Something was terribly wrong with the furnace. The air itself felt wrong. I ran to open doors and windows, and I shut the furnace off as quickly as I could. Later, we discovered it had been carbon monoxide that had been making me sick. If I had stayed asleep much longer, I might not be here today. That is not me being dramatic. That is simple truth. Had I not heard Lucky barking, had I not woken up when I did, had I not acted quickly, I might have died in that house that night. Once we replaced the furnace and everything was safe again, I never heard him bark after that. Not once. Just that one time, when I needed him most. People can explain things however they want. They can say grief does strange things to the mind. They can say memory shaped the sound for me. They can say it was coincidence. But deep in my heart, I know what happened. Lucky warned me. He came back long enough to save me. And after he did not need to come again. That was when I truly began to believe that faithful and loving pets may still try to protect us even after death. But in truth, the idea that animals can sense danger, especially spiritual danger, had been with me since I was a child. Long before Lucky, long before the farm, long before adulthood taught me how strange life can be, I had already seen animals react to things that people could not see. When I was very young, my parents always had cats or dogs in the house. Looking back, I realize now that on many occasions those animals sensed unseen visitors before any of us understood what was happening. Maybe it was something about the houses we lived in. Maybe some spirits passed through those places. Maybe there were presences that meant no harm, and others that did. I cannot say for sure. But I can say this, animals knew. They always knew. One of the clearest memories I have of that came when I was about 5 or 6 years old. We were living in an old house then. It was the kind of house that made noises at night, but not just the ordinary creaks of settling wood. This house felt creepy in a way that seemed alive. Even in daylight there was something off about it. And at night it was worse. Still, strange things did not happen only after dark. My mother would sometimes be in the kitchen during the day, cooking or cleaning, and she would hear the front door open and footsteps crossing the living room floor. It sounded so real that she would call out, "I'll be there in a minute," thinking it must be one of the neighbor women coming by. Then she would go to look, only to find no one there. No one in the house. No one at the door. No explanation. I remember the look that would pass between us when it happened, that silent little shiver of fear two people share when something unexplainable has just brushed past ordinary life. And it did not happen only once. It happened enough that it became part of the strange character of the house. One night, I woke up and heard our dog Tippy growling beside my bed. That alone was enough to scare me, because dogs do not growl like that without reason. Her growl was low and serious, the kind that says she has seen something and does not like it. I strained to see in the dim little nightlight glow, and there, in the room, I saw the shadow of a man. He was large. He wore a hat and a long coat. I did what frightened children do. I yanked the covers over my head and stayed there, terrified, trying to hide from what I had seen. The next morning I told my parents about the man. They looked at me, then looked at each other, and before much else could be said, the phone rang. It was my grandmother. She was calling to say that my father's Uncle Jimmy had died the night before. Now Uncle Jimmy never frightened us in life. He was a big man with a loud, gruff voice, and he always wore a black hat and a long black coat. He sent greeting cards to my brother and me and laughed with us. He was kind. The moment I heard he had died, I understood in the simple way a child can sometimes understand things that adults struggle to explain. The man in my room had been Uncle Jimmy. Tippy did not know that. She was only doing her job. She had seen someone by my bed and she was guarding me. To her, the dead were no different from the living when it came to protecting the children. That old house had another frightening place in it too, the upstairs. We used it only for storage. My mother never liked going up there, and I was not allowed to go there either. I did not understand why then. I only knew there was something about it that made the adults uneasy. One day, Tippy started barking at the foot of those stairs. My mother told me to stay downstairs and said she would be back in a minute. I did not want her to go up there alone, but she insisted. She climbed the stairs while Tippy remained upset below. After a few minutes passed with no sound from my mother, I called out to her. There was no answer. I called again, louder. Mom! Finally, she came down the stairs slowly. I still remember her face. It was white, and her eyes looked fixed on nothing. She told me, "Come, Brenda, let's get out of here for a while." She got my brother, helped us put on our coats, and took us out of the house. When my father came home, she told him we had to find another place to live. She said she had seen a woman upstairs and that it was not safe for the children there. She said Tippy had gone crazy for a reason, and now she knew why. We moved soon after that. But whatever was in that old house did not leave us behind so easily. Somehow, it seemed to follow us, or perhaps the same sensitivity that brought strange things into our lives remained with us no matter where we went. At the next house, we had a neighbor named Lola. She often came over and would let us know she was there by calling out, "Yahoo!" before coming in. One day we heard footsteps on the porch, and then the front door open. At first we thought nothing of it. We assumed it was Lola. But Tippy started growling and barking, and instantly we knew it was not her. No one was there. Nothing visible. Just footsteps, an opening door, and our dog reacting to someone we could not see. Later, over a cup of coffee to settle everyone's nerves, my mother told Lola about the footsteps. Lola laughed, and said it was probably just the ghost of the old man who used to live there, and that he would not hurt a flea. That may have comforted some people, but it did not change Tippy's behavior. Just like before, she would bark for no reason, stay close to us, and stare at places where nothing visible stood. Then one day my mother had enough. She lost patience and said out loud, "What in the name of God do you want?" There was no answer, but after that, whatever had been bothering us stopped. We lived in peace there until we moved again. So by the time Lucky barked from beyond death and saved me from the carbon monoxide, I had already spent years learning that animals know things. Tippy had warned us when unseen visitors came into our homes. She had stood guard beside my bed when Uncle Jimmy came after his death. She had barked at the foot of the stairs before my mother saw the woman upstairs. She had reacted when footsteps entered a house with no visible person attached to them. Time after time, the dog knew before we did. And then Lucky, after death itself, still knew. That is why I believe what I do. I believe animals often see what we cannot. I believe they sense danger, both physical and spiritual. I believe they do their best to protect the people they love. And I believe that sometimes, love is strong enough to outlast death itself. As I grew older, I noticed something else. The dead do not always go to the other side right away. Sometimes they linger. Sometimes they stay near loved ones for a while. Sometimes they seem confused or unwilling to leave. Sometimes they come with messages or with comfort. Family members have visited me too. My father came near the time of his death. My mother did as well. These visits were not always easy or peaceful. Sometimes they were frightening simply because the world does not feel natural when the dead step back into it. But I have learned that most of the time they do not mean us harm. More often than not, they come out of love, worry, unfinished business, or simply the need to say goodbye. Animals, I think, may understand this better than we do. They do not argue with the impossible. They do not need religion, theory, or philosophy to explain what stands before them. They only know whether something is there, and whether their people need protection. That is what makes their warning so pure. It comes from instinct, loyalty, and love. Even now, when I think of Lucky, I do not only remember his life. I remember his last gift to me. I remember his bark in the middle of the night. I remember how happy I felt for 1 second to hear him again. I remember the shock of realizing he was dead, and should not have been there at all. I remember turning on the light, feeling terribly sick, and then finding the furnace problem just in time. I remember opening the doors and windows, breathing cold air, and realizing later how close I had come to not surviving that night. And I remember that after the furnace was replaced and I was safe, I never heard him again. That matters to me. He came, did what he needed to do, and then was gone. Not haunting. Not lingering for no reason. Just protecting. The same way Tippy had done in life. The same way, perhaps, Uncle Jimmy came one last time to see the family he loved. The same way my parents later made their presence known to me in their own ways. The world is stranger than many people want to believe. But not all strange things are evil. Some are acts of love. Some are warnings. Some are goodbyes. Some are protection. And if anyone asks me now whether a beloved pet can still watch over us after death, I do not hesitate anymore. Yes. I believe they can. I believe Lucky did. And I believe that somewhere, somehow, the animals who loved us still keep watch, especially when danger comes quietly in the night, and we do not yet know we need saving. Before this happened, I truly believed I was ready for anything the paranormal world could throw at me. I had been ghost hunting for about 7 months by then, and in my own mind that already felt like a serious commitment. I had not just stumbled into it for fun one weekend and then moved on. I had spent a couple of years reading, watching, listening, and trying to understand the paranormal long before I ever started going out into the field. I was fascinated by spirits, hauntings, strange energy, and everything that seemed to exist just outside normal human understanding. The unseen world did not scare me in the way it scares many people. At least that is what I told myself. I thought of myself as curious, serious, and maybe even a little brave. I believed that if strange things happened, I would be able to handle them. By that point, I was also trying to build a team. I had chosen a name for it, and everything. We were called GPS, which stood for Ghostly Appalachian Paranormal Society. I was proud of that. To me, the name made us sound organized and serious, like we were not just people wandering around in the dark hoping to get scared. We were investigators, or at least we wanted to be. We wanted to look into hauntings, collect experiences, and maybe understand things other people only whispered about. I had a deep interest in spirits, and believed that if you approached them with the right amount of respect and courage, you could learn something real. But I also learned the hard way that there is a difference between curiosity and wisdom. There is also a difference between looking for something and being truly ready when it answers. I learned that lesson in a place called Buttermilk. By the time of that particular night, I had already been there 4 times before. Each time I had gone with different people, and each visit had only made the place feel more mysterious to me. It had that kind of reputation that attracts people who want to test themselves or prove something to themselves. Every town has places like that, places with stories attached to them, places where people say odd things happen, places where fear grows larger every time the story is retold. Buttermilk was one of those places. It was not some ruined mansion or famous haunted asylum. It was a wooded area, dark and thick and unsettling in a very natural way. The road there split into 2 directions, and the whole area was heavily wooded, used mostly for bear hunting. That alone was enough to make me uneasy, because I have always been terrified of wild animals. Ghosts were one thing. Wild animals were another. Trees, darkness, and isolation may sound romantic in stories, but in real life they can make you feel small very quickly, especially when you know something living and dangerous could be out there. Still, I kept that fear to myself because I did not want to look weak or nervous in front of the others. I wanted to be taken seriously. The main story people told about that place was that a man had once died there from freezing while hunting. According to local talk, he had been out there without a coat, and after he died, the spirit that remained behind would tug on people's coats if they passed through his area. It sounds simple when you say it aloud. Almost harmless. A ghost that tugs coats. Something eerie, yes, but nothing to panic over. At least that is how I had treated it in my mind at first. I had been there several times already and thought I had a sense of the place. I believed that if anything happened, it would stay within the boundaries of that little legend. A coat tug here, a chill there, maybe an odd feeling, maybe a strange photograph. I never imagined that anything from that place would follow me home in a way that made me feel like I was being hollowed out from the inside. That night, I was with one guy and 3 other girls. We had permission to be there because one family lived at the far end of the right side of the road, and they had allowed us to come in and investigate. That made us feel legitimate somehow, as if permission from the living would keep us safe from anything else. It was almost dark when we got there. The sky was at that uneasy point between evening and full night, where you can still see the outlines of things but the shadows have already become stronger than the light. The woods around us seemed thicker as darkness crept in. Sounds carried differently. Every small movement in the trees made itself known. Every breeze seemed to pass through the branches with intention. At first we did what ghost hunting groups always do. We walked around the road. We looked. We listened. We took pictures. We tried to see whether anything unusual would happen naturally. But eventually we did what, looking back now, I wish we had never done. We decided to provoke. Even now, writing that makes my stomach tighten, because that was the turning point. There are some lines you should never cross, and trying to provoke whatever might be present in a place like that is one of them. But when you are eager, when you want evidence, when you are trying to prove yourself as someone serious in the paranormal field, it becomes dangerously easy to talk yourself into foolishness. You tell yourself you are being bold. You tell yourself you are getting results. You tell yourself that if a spirit is real, it should be able to respond. What you do not stop to ask often enough is whether it should respond, and whether you are ready for the consequences if it does. Before we even really started, I got a terrible feeling inside. It came over me strongly and suddenly, like a warning from somewhere deep in my body. It was not a passing nervousness. It was not just the usual tension of being in the woods at night. It was a sick, heavy feeling, the kind that sits in your stomach and makes the air around you feel wrong. I remember telling my main partner about it because I could not ignore it. I needed someone else to know I was feeling that bad before anything had even happened. But she shrugged it off. Maybe she thought I was just nervous. Maybe she did not want my fear affecting the group mood. Maybe she believed, as I wanted to believe too, that we were still in control of the situation. We were not. We started walking one by one through the area where the spirit was said to remain. That alone should have told me we were treating the place too casually, almost like it was a game. One by one, like taking turns challenging something unseen. The 3 other girls went through first. Nothing happened to them. At least nothing obvious. Then the guy walked through and immediately said his coat had been tugged from behind. The second he said it, everyone's attention sharpened. The story had come to life. The old legend about the dead hunter without a coat suddenly did not seem like just a story anymore. Then it was my turn. And, just my luck, I was wearing my husband's coat. That detail always stayed with me because something about wearing his coat made me feel even more exposed afterward, as though whatever touched me did not only touch me, but touched something connected to my home life too. I walked through the same area, trying to stay calm, trying not to let the fear take over. And then I felt it. My coat got tugged right below my right shoulder blade. It was not a vague brush of fabric. It was a clear tug. I knew it instantly. I told everyone right away. At that point, my main partner took out her dowsing rods and began asking questions. She wanted to communicate. She wanted answers. She wanted interaction. I did not take much part in that. I could not. The feeling inside me had already become so strong that I felt almost sick. While the others focused on the rods and the spirit story, I found myself doing something else entirely. I kept scanning the woods, watching for movement, listening for animals. My fear of wild animals was still with me, and that fear was easier to admit to myself than the other kind. The truth is, I think my body was already trying to find a normal, earthly danger to focus on because the spiritual one was becoming too much. Then a cold spot appeared in the middle of the dirt road. All of us felt it. It came out of nowhere and grew larger. The temperature around us dropped fast and sharply. It was not the normal kind of evening chill that arrives slowly as night deepens. It was a sudden pocket of intense cold, and the longer we stayed with it, the colder it became. At the same time, I felt my coat get tugged again in the exact same spot. I told everyone immediately. The guy in our group said his coat had been tugged again too. The cold became unbearable. It felt like the temperature had dropped to around 20 degrees or lower, even though it was fall and the real temperature that night was somewhere near 60. Nightfall had arrived by then, yes, but that did not explain what we were feeling. The whole month had not gone below 40 degrees, and this was much colder than that. This was the kind of cold that gets into your bones, not the kind that merely makes you shiver. It felt unnatural. It felt focused. And instead of leaving, we followed it. For around 10 minutes, maybe a little more, we followed that cold spot while my partner kept using the dowsing rods. Looking back, I can hardly believe we did that. It is one thing to witness something strange. It is another to walk after it like you are inviting it deeper into your space. But that is exactly what we did. We kept moving with it, talking, questioning, trying to interpret, while the air around us became more and more raw. Then I felt something grab me. It took hold of my right arm, just above the elbow. It was not a brush. It was not the wind. It was not my imagination. It was a grab. I looked immediately to my right, because that was where the touch had come from, and there was no one there. I told everyone at once. I was scared by then in a way I had not been before. The coat tugging was one thing. This was direct. This was contact. What made it even stranger was the feeling in the place where I had been touched. The coat around that area felt hot. Very hot. Which made no sense at all in the middle of that freezing cold. I kept touching the spot because it was so unnaturally warm compared to the rest of me. It was not just my own skin heating from nerves. It was the fabric itself that felt hot through my fingers. I told one of the girls to touch it too, because I needed to know whether I was imagining that part. She touched it and said it felt hot to her too. That was when I really started begging to leave. I told them I was freezing. I told them I was ready to go. I told them something was wrong. But nobody else wanted to leave. For some reason, no one was as cold as I was. No one seemed to be feeling the same level of fear or physical distress. I became numb. My body was shaking, and yet I could hardly feel myself properly anymore. I had never been so cold in my life. Not normal cold. Not weather cold. It was a dead, draining kind of cold, like something had settled into me instead of around me. I begged again, and finally they agreed. We got back in the car and headed home, but the ride felt endless. I could not warm up. I could not calm down. Something already felt wrong inside me. I told my husband when I got home that I was freezing and that I felt terribly run down. It was late, close to midnight, and I could not sleep at all. I felt like something was inside me, draining me, taking my life from the inside out. That sounds dramatic, but there is no softer way to describe it. It was horrible. I felt overwhelmed with sadness, isolation, and anger all at once. Those emotions did not feel natural either. They came over me like a wave, and I could not separate what was mine from what seemed to have attached itself to me. I cried myself to sleep because I did not know what else to do. It felt like I had brought something home with me, something that had followed the fear I opened in those woods and decided not to let go. When I woke the next morning, I was very sick. I could hardly talk. I was not thinking clearly. I felt out of my head, as if my mind and body were both caught under something heavy and ugly. I was still cold. Still numb. I curled up near the heater, trying to get warm, but I could not even feel the heat. That was one of the worst parts. My body no longer responded to comfort the way it should have. Heat did not feel like heat. Safety did not feel like safety. It was as if something had moved into the space where normal feeling lives and pushed everything else aside. I remember asking God to help me. By then I was no longer treating any of this like an experiment. I was no longer curious. I was frightened in a way that reached down into my spirit. I asked God to help me get rid of whatever was on me. I started yelling at it, telling it to leave and never come back. I tried to cast it out with every bit of faith and desperation I had. I knew then that I was not dealing with some playful ghost story or an interesting haunting. I believed I was dealing with something evil. Finally, I called a priest. That was not a small decision for me. By then I felt humbled in a way I had never been before. All my confidence, all my talk about being prepared, all my certainty that I could handle the paranormal, all of it had been burned out of me in one night. I had gone looking for contact. I had allowed myself to become afraid on purpose. I had participated in provocation. I had followed cold darkness down a road in the woods. And then I had come home with something I could not control. After going to church, I felt much better. Not instantly perfect, not magically without memory, but better. The heaviness eased. The cold loosened its grip. My mind felt more like my own again. I could breathe more normally. I could think more clearly. It was like coming back into myself after being partly buried under something. And with that relief came understanding. I had learned my lesson. I had thought I could play with forces I did not fully respect and somehow stay untouched by them. I had believed knowledge and curiosity were enough protection. I had believed I could walk into dark places, ask questions, stir things up, and then walk out again as if I was still the one in control. I was wrong. The lesson was simple, and it was hard. If you play with fire, you get burned. People say that all the time in ordinary life, but I understand it now in a much deeper way. The paranormal is not always mysterious in a harmless way. Not every spirit is lost and sad. Not every haunting is gentle. Not every place should be questioned, challenged, or provoked. Sometimes what waits in the dark is not something you should ever invite closer. Buttermilk taught me that. It taught me that legends can be doors, and if you knock hard enough, something can answer. It taught me that fear is not just a feeling. It is energy. It is an opening. It taught me that not everything touching your coat in the woods is the spirit of some poor hunter wanting to be noticed. And it taught me that bringing something home is far easier than sending it away. Even now, when I think back on that road, I remember how foolish I was to believe I understood what I was dealing with. I remember the thick woods on either side, the road splitting in two, the dark settling over us, the family living at the end who had given us permission as if human permission meant anything to the dead. I remember the dowsing rods, the pictures, the listening, the confidence. I remember the first coat tug and the second. The way the cold came alive in the middle of the road. The way it spread. The way I followed it instead of running from it. Most of all, I remember how alone I felt even while standing in a group. No one was as cold as I was. No one seemed to feel how wrong it had become. That still stays with me, because it makes me wonder whether whatever came near us chose me specifically from the beginning. Maybe because I was already open. Maybe because I deliberately fed fear into the room like an experiment earlier in my own home life, and had trained myself to stand too close to things I should have respected. Maybe because I was weaker spiritually that night than I wanted to believe. I do not know. But I know it took hold of me in a way it did not seem to take hold of the others. The right side of my body especially remains in my memory. The tug below the shoulder blade. The grab above the elbow. The hot spot on my coat. It was as if I had been marked in stages. First a touch to get my attention. Then a stronger touch to claim it. Then the cold entering me on the ride home. Even writing it now makes me shiver because I remember exactly how it felt. The body remembers these things even when years begin to soften the mind. I no longer see ghost hunting the way I used to. There was a time when I thought of it as adventure mixed with mystery, something bold and maybe even useful if done seriously enough. But now I believe there must be real caution, real boundaries, and real spiritual protection, or you are simply standing in the dark asking for trouble. We do not know enough to provoke. We do not know enough to think curiosity alone is safe. Some things do not need your questions. Some things only need your invitation. That night at Buttermilk I gave one. And I paid for it. I still believe in the paranormal. I still know there is an other world, as people call it. But now I know that not everything in it should be approached. Not everything in it wants conversation. Some of it wants fear. Some of it wants entry. Some of it wants to see how far it can get if you open the door yourself. I opened that door. And for one terrible night and morning, something walked through it and tried to stay. I thank God it did not. I thank God I had enough sense left in me to pray, to fight, and to call someone wiser than myself. And I thank God that what I learned cost me fear and sickness, but not my life. Because I truly believe if I had kept going down that path the way I was going, if I had kept treating dark places and unknown spirits like challenges I was meant to conquer, something worse would have happened eventually. What happened at Buttermilk was enough. It taught me that some roads in the woods are not just roads. Some cold spots are not just cold. And some voices or touches from the other side are not invitations to learn. They are warnings. And sometimes, by the time you realize that, it is already much closer than you ever meant to let it get. About a year ago, 4 of my friends and I went to Wiseman's View off the Blue Ridge Parkway, and even now, when I think back on that night, I still feel the same cold fear settle into me. At the time, it sounded like the kind of thing young people do all the time without thinking too deeply about it. We wanted an adventure. We wanted a good view. We wanted a story to tell afterward. None of us really stopped to think that some places feel very different after dark, especially mountain places, places with cliffs, deep woods, and long drops into black valleys. During the day, they can look beautiful, peaceful, even welcoming. But at night they can become something else entirely. That night, for whatever reason, we made the decision to go without flashlights or lanterns. Looking back, that was probably the first foolish thing we did. At the time it felt exciting, almost bold, like we were proving we were not scared of the dark. But darkness in the mountains is not like darkness in town. It is thicker. It feels alive. It does not just hide things from you. It makes you feel like something is already hidden there waiting for you to notice. The 5 of us made our way up there together, talking and joking as we went, the way people do when they are trying not to admit they are a little uneasy. The trail itself did not seem too bad at first, at least not while we were still moving as a group. There is comfort in hearing the voices of other people around you, especially at night. You focus on the sound of your friends, on your own footsteps, on whatever little nonsense is being said, and that helps keep your imagination under control. We walked the whole trail and finally reached the ledge where people usually go to look out over the valley. That was the point of going, after all. We wanted to watch the lights below. And I will admit, for a while it was worth it. The view was beautiful in its own eerie way. The valley lights seemed tiny and far away, as if you were looking down at another world. They flickered softly in the distance, and the darkness around them only made them stand out more. We stayed there for about an hour, just sitting, talking, watching the lights, and letting time pass. By the time we were ready to leave, it was close to midnight. The darkness around us had become almost complete. The only light came from the valley below, and the occasional weak glow from our cell phones. There was no moonlight strong enough to make the trail feel safe. The woods around us had become one dark wall. It was one of those nights when every tree seems taller, every shadow deeper, and every quiet moment makes you more aware of how far away you are from anything normal. My boyfriend, his friend, and I had gotten cold and tired of sitting there staring at the lights. We were ready to head back to the Jeep. The other two wanted to stay a little longer, so we left them behind and started making our way back up the trail on our own. At first, I was only focused on getting back to the Jeep. I was cold, my legs were tired, and I was ready to get somewhere enclosed, even if it was only a parked vehicle in the dark. Heather was walking a few feet ahead of Justin and me. Justin and I were side by side, moving carefully because the trail was hard enough to follow with almost no light. The dark felt close all around us. It was not just dark overhead or dark in the distance. It felt as if the darkness itself had crowded right up to the edge of the path. The trees, the underbrush, the slope of the mountain, everything had disappeared into one black mass. You could not really see what was out there unless something caught the light, and even then it was only for a second. It was in one of those seconds that I saw them. I happened to glance to the side, and there they were, two green eyes hanging there in the dark at about 6 feet off the ground. I still remember the exact shock of that moment. It did not feel like slowly noticing something. It felt like my whole body understood what I was seeing before my mind could even catch up. Those eyes were not on the ground where you might expect an animal to be. They were too high, too still, too strange. They were just there in the dark, watching. I screamed immediately. It was not the kind of scream you let out on purpose for attention. It ripped out of me before I could stop it. The second I screamed, Justin looked over too, and he saw them as well. That made everything worse because it meant I had not imagined it. I had not mistaken some reflection or some leaf catching light. He saw them too. We both called for Heather, and the next thing I knew all three of us were running back toward the Jeep as fast as we could. There is a certain kind of running people do when they are scared in the dark, and it is not graceful. It is blind panic mixed with the desperate hope that your feet will keep landing where they should. We were no longer trying to be quiet or brave. We were just trying to get away. The trail seemed longer on the way back than it had on the way out. Every step felt like it might go wrong. Every branch and shadow felt like it might be reaching. The only thing in my mind was getting to the Jeep and locking the doors. Nothing else mattered. When we got there, we threw ourselves inside and locked the doors immediately. It was as if shutting those doors between us and the woods might make whatever we had seen stay outside. We were breathing hard, trying to talk over one another, trying to make sense of what we had seen. But there was another problem now. Chris and Lacey were still back at the ledge. They had stayed behind. We looked out into the dark, waiting for them to come up the trail, but the minutes started passing and they did not appear. At first, maybe we only felt worried in a general way. Then the worry started growing into something worse. We waited for what felt like forever, but was probably about half an hour. They still did not come back. That is when the mind starts doing terrible things to you. We began thinking of all the worst possibilities. Had they fallen off the ledge? Had something happened on the trail? Had whatever had been watching us gotten to them somehow? It sounds dramatic now, but when you are sitting in a Jeep in the middle of the night after seeing green eyes floating too high above the ground, Your mind does not stay calm and reasonable for long. It takes whatever fear it has and builds monsters out of it. We kept looking, and every second felt too long. Then, all at once, they came running out of the dark toward the jeep. They were screaming too. It was such a relief to see them alive and running that for a second I could hardly think. We unlocked the doors and let them in fast, and once they were inside, everyone started talking at once. Before I could even tell them what we had seen, they told us that they had seen the exact same thing in the exact same place. That detail mattered so much because it took away any chance of brushing it off as imagination. We had not been able to call them. There was no cell phone service out there. No one could have warned them or planted the idea in their minds. Yet they had seen the same thing, in the same place, on the same trail. Whatever those eyes belonged to, it had not only been there for us. It was there for them too. On the drive back down the road, I kept looking out into the woods even though I almost did not want to. Part of me hoped I would see nothing, because then maybe the whole experience could start fading into one of those stories people tell and exaggerate later. But every time I glanced toward the trees, I could still see the eyes. That made the whole thing feel even more wrong. It was not just one moment on the trail that was now behind us. It felt like whatever we had seen was following us with its gaze, staying in the woods while still letting us know it was there. And I still do not believe it was any normal animal. People can suggest all kinds of things when they hear a story like this. They can say it was a deer, a bear, some mountain animal reflecting light from our phones or the jeep. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what all of us saw. Those eyes were too high, too still, and too wrong for that explanation to satisfy me. We were frightened because something about the sight of them did not fit. We were not reacting to some ordinary animal on the side of a trail. And again, it was not just me. Everyone else saw it too. A few weeks later, I went back to Wiseman's View. I know that sounds crazy after what had happened, and maybe it was. But that is the strange thing about places that scare us. Sometimes they also pull us back because part of us wants to understand them. Part of us wants to see them in daylight, and prove that they are ordinary after all. That was probably part of my thinking. We did not go at night this time because we were too scared. Daylight felt safer. Daylight made it easier to believe that what had happened before belonged to darkness, and would lose some of its power under the sun. So we went during the day and sat at the ledge telling ghost stories. That was probably another bad idea, though of course it did not feel that way then. When young people gather in a place with a scary reputation, ghost stories always seem to come naturally. We started talking about people falling off that very ledge and dying. It is a very long drop there, probably close to half a mile or so, and once you stand at the edge and look down, you understand immediately how dangerous it would be if someone slipped. The mountain does not forgive mistakes. The drop is too steep, too deep, too final. As we were talking, I happened to glance down and thought I saw someone on another ledge about 30 feet below us. That is what I believed for a second anyway. I remember looking harder because something about it felt impossible. That ledge was not somewhere a normal person could just walk to. You would need climbing equipment, or some other way to get there safely. It was not accessible in any simple way. So seeing, or thinking I saw, someone there was deeply unsettling. I still do not know whether it was my imagination feeding on all the stories we were telling, or whether I really saw someone. But I know the moment stayed with me because the shape looked enough like a person that it made my stomach turn. That is another thing about Wiseman's View. It seems to invite that kind of uncertainty. You see something and are never fully sure whether it was real, imagined, or something in between. And maybe that is what makes it so frightening. It does not give you clean answers. It gives you moments that sit in your mind and refuse to settle. There are also a lot of stories about people killing themselves on that trail because it is isolated and not heavily traveled. My stepmother once told me a story that made the whole place feel even darker. Her son had gone to Appalachian State in Boone, and she said there had been a guy at the school who disappeared. The police searched and searched but could not find him. Finally, because they were getting desperate, they brought in a psychic investigator. Now, Wiseman's View is about an hour from campus, so at first that does not seem like the obvious place to search. But according to the story, the psychic immediately told the police that they would find their answer there. And according to that same story, when they got there, they found him hanging from a tree about 40 feet in the air. I have seen that tree, or at least the tree people say it was, and to me it does not look like something a person could climb easily at all. It looks wrong for that kind of death. Of course, stories grow over time, especially in places with a reputation. So I do not know whether every detail of that story is true. I do know I read the article about the student. The death itself was real. They ruled it a suicide. But if he really was hanging from the tree the way people say, then I find it hard to believe he managed that entirely on his own. Something about that part of the story has always felt deeply unsettling to me, because it suggests a help that is not human, or at least not entirely. Maybe that is only fear talking. Maybe it is just the atmosphere of the place working on me. But Wiseman's view does not feel like a normal place once you have had an experience there. It stops being just a scenic overlook. It becomes a place where things watch, where stories linger, where the past feels too close, and where your own mind no longer trusts what your eyes show you. Once that happens, every local story gains more weight. Every rumor sounds a little more possible. Every odd shape in the woods seems loaded with meaning. When I think back to that first night, one of the things that frightens me most is how simple it started. 5 friends drove somewhere scary because it sounded fun. That is all. No rituals, no seance, no challenge thrown into the dark. Just a bunch of young people at a scenic overlook at night without proper lights, talking and watching the valley. The danger did not announce itself in some big dramatic way. It waited until some of us were already heading back, already tired, already relaxed enough to think the night might end normally. Then there were those eyes. And those eyes changed everything. I still remember how high they were. That detail stays with me because it was so wrong. If they had been low to the ground, perhaps the memory would not have stayed the same way. But 6 feet in the air is too high for comfort, too high to ignore, and too high to make an easy explanation feel good enough. It felt as though something was standing there just off the trail, tall enough to look us in the eye if it had stepped closer. The green color of the eyes also bothers me. It was not soft or natural looking the way many animal eyes reflect. It was sharp, distinct. It stood out in the blackness in a way that felt deliberate. Eyes are powerful things in fear because they make you feel recognized. It is one thing to hear a sound in the woods. It is another to know something is looking directly at you. When I saw those eyes, I did not feel like I had simply noticed part of the landscape. I felt like I had been noticed back. And that is why I screamed. It was not just fear of the unknown. It was the terrible feeling that whatever was there knew we were there too. The fact that Chris and Lacey saw the same thing in the same place matters more than almost anything else. If it had just been my boyfriend, his friend, and me, maybe people could say we worked each other up. But the other 2 stayed behind and had their own experience. They came back running and screaming before we even had a chance to tell them what had happened. That shared fear gives the whole thing a kind of certainty that is hard to shake. I have often wondered what would have happened if any of us had been alone that night. Would we have believed our own eyes? Would we have told anyone? Or would we have buried the memory and tried to convince ourselves we had seen some animal in bad light? There is something strangely comforting in shared fear, because at least then you know you are not carrying the impossible by yourself. At the same time, that shared fear makes the place harder to dismiss. The second daytime trip also taught me something. Daylight does not always make a place safe. It only makes it easier to pretend that what frightened you there belongs to the night. But some places hold on to their stories no matter what time of day you visit them. Sitting at that ledge in daylight, talking about people who had fallen, and then thinking I saw someone on a lower ledge, reminded me that the place itself was enough to get under your skin. The danger there was real even before you added ghosts, suicides, psychics, or strange eyes in the woods. It was a place where death would not feel out of place. And maybe that is why the stories attach themselves there so strongly. Places like that collect energy. That is the only way I know how to say it. If people have died there, If people have been frightened there, if despair has brought people there to end their lives, then perhaps the place keeps some of that. Perhaps the mountain remembers. Perhaps the woods do. Perhaps whatever looked at us that night was not even one simple thing, but part of a larger darkness attached to that whole area. I do not know. I only know that Wiseman's view feels wrong to me in a way no beautiful view should feel wrong. What I hate most is the uncertainty. I can tell you exactly what happened. I can describe the trail, the ledge, the valley lights, the midnight darkness, the eyes, the screaming, the running, the waiting in the jeep, the others seeing the same thing, the return during the day, the strange figure below the ledge, and the story about the student. But I cannot give you the answer everyone wants. I cannot say with confidence, this is exactly what it was. Because I do not know. Maybe it was something inhuman in the woods. Maybe it was some spirit tied to the place. Maybe it was a thing that feeds on fear and isolation. Maybe it was a story made visible because so many dark stories already cling to that overlook. Maybe it was all of those things at once. But whatever it was enough to change the way I look at places like that forever. Now, when people talk lightly about going somewhere creepy at night just for fun, I think about that trail. I think about how easy it is to believe you are just going somewhere to get scared in a playful way. And I think about how fast that feeling can change when the place seems to answer you back. Some places are not just spooky because people say they are. Some places feel as though they are holding something, and all it takes is one good look into the dark to understand that you were never as alone there as you thought. The image of those green eyes is still with me. So is the sight of Chris and Lacey running out of the darkness. So is the strange sick feeling that came later when I looked down at that lower ledge and thought I saw a person where no person should have been. And so is the story of that hanging tree, whether every detail is true or not, because by then I had already seen enough to know that Wiseman's view was not just another overlook on the Blue Ridge Parkway. It was a place where the dark seemed to have eyes. And once you have seen that for yourself, it becomes impossible to go back to treating the place like just another beautiful mountain view. I worked in an office where the phones were far more complicated than the old simple desk phones people used to have. Mine was part of one of those large business phone systems that could handle calls from outside the building and calls from anywhere inside it too. Because of the way the system was set up, my phone gave me information on every call. If someone from outside the building called me, the caller ID would show only the phone number. If the call came from inside the building, the screen would show the person's name and their extension number too. I was used to that system. After a while, a person stops even thinking about it. You just glance down when the phone rings, see who it is, and answer or return the call as needed. I had my own private office, which was a blessing because it gave me a little peace in a building that could get noisy and hectic. Still, I tried not to shut myself off completely from everyone. I believed in keeping an open-door policy whenever I could, partly because I wanted people to feel comfortable coming to me and partly because I liked knowing what was going on around the office. When the door was open, I could hear movement in the hall, bits of conversations drifting in and out, footsteps, laughter, phones ringing, and all the small living noises that make up a workday. Of course, when things got too noisy and I really needed to focus, I would shut the door and work in quiet. The administrative assistant and I had become fairly close over time. In a workplace, that kind of friendship grows naturally sometimes. You pass each other all day long, help each other with things, share frustrations, laugh about little office problems, and over time that turns into real trust. Her office sat catty-corner from mine, close enough that when my door was open, I could sometimes hear voices coming from her office. Not full conversations that I could make out clearly, but just the sense of voices there, bits of sound, movement, and normal office life. None of that was unusual. It was the kind of thing you stop noticing because it happens every day. Then, a few days before everything finally made sense, something happened that at the time seemed only strange and easy to dismiss. I was sitting at my desk, working as usual, with my door open. The building was not especially loud, just the normal low-level background of a business day. Without any warning at all, I heard a female voice say very clearly, Help her. Watch out for her. She will need you. The words were distinct. They were not mumbled. They were not vague. I heard them exactly. The voice was female, but it was not one I recognized. That was the first thing that stood out to me. In an office, you become familiar with voices quickly. You know the people you work with, even if only by the sounds of them. This voice did not belong to anyone I could place. I sat there for just a second, trying to decide whether someone had walked past my door or spoken from a nearby office. Then I got up and looked down the hallway. There was no one there. I checked the nearby offices too, thinking maybe someone had stepped out of sight or moved just as I stood up. But those offices were empty too. No one was there. It was one of those strange little moments that makes you pause, frown, and scratch your head before deciding you must have misunderstood something. That was exactly what I did. I stood there a moment, unsettled but not alarmed, and then I went back to my desk and moved on with the rest of the day. The next day, though, it happened again, only this time there was no easy way to dismiss it. I was in my office when I heard the same female voice again. This time, however, it was coming through my phone. It said the exact same thing as before, in the same clear way. Help her. Watch out for her. She will need you. That got my attention immediately. My phone, as I said, only rang on my end for incoming calls. It did not just suddenly play voices for no reason. When I heard the words, I looked at the display. The screen showed the administrative assistant's name and her extension number. Then, just like that, the call disconnected. I sat there for a second staring at the phone. It was a strange enough moment that I did not know whether to laugh at it, question my own hearing, or call her right away. Of course I called her. I needed to know whether she had just tried to reach me. When she answered, I asked her directly if she had tried to call me. She said no. She sounded busy, said she was in the middle of something, and there was nothing in her tone that suggested she was joking or playing some weird office prank. I let it go for the moment because, frankly, I did not know what else to do. But the whole thing bothered me more than the first incident had. Hearing a voice in the office air was one thing. Hearing it come through the phone while my screen displayed the administrative assistant's name and extension was another. The next day, it happened a couple more times. The same voice. The same message. Help her. Watch out for her. She will need you. And every single time, when I looked at the phone, the display showed the administrative assistant's name and extension. That was the part that made it feel impossible in a very practical, office kind of way. The system was not mysterious to me. I understood how it worked. It could be annoying sometimes, yes, but not magical. If a person inside the building called, the name and extension showed. If an outside line called, the number showed. It was a straightforward system. Yet somehow these strange voice calls kept appearing as if they came from her office, except she was not calling me. Over the next few weeks, the same thing happened several more times. There was no pattern to the timing. The calls did not come at one set hour, or only in the morning or only when the office was quiet. They came randomly. A call would appear on my phone without it actually ringing. That was another very strange detail. My phone never rang for these calls. I would simply hear the voice, look at the screen, and there would be her name and extension. Then the call would disconnect. I asked her about it more than once. Every time, the answer was the same. No. She had not called me. And on more than one occasion, the call seemed to come when no one was even in her office at all. That detail pushed the whole thing beyond ordinary explanation. If she had denied calling but had at least been in the room near the phone, I might have wondered whether the system was malfunctioning somehow or whether someone else had picked up her extension by mistake. But if her office was empty, then what exactly was using her line, and why only to say those same 3 sentences? I did not know what to make of it. At first, I suppose I tried to stay rational. Offices are full of strange technical glitches. Phones do odd things. Intercoms break. Caller ID systems fail. Static and cross lines happen. But this was never static. This was never broken sound or chopped up words. The voice was clear, calm, and specific. It said the same thing every time. That repetition mattered. Random technical trouble does not usually form perfect warnings. And the warning was always about her. Help her. Watch out for her. She will need you. I could not ignore that part, no matter how much I wanted to explain the calls away. Then came the Friday I took off. It was just a normal day off, nothing dramatic about that. I was not in the office, so I knew nothing about what happened while I was gone. It was not until I returned to work on Monday that I learned something had happened to the administrative assistant. She had suffered an asthma attack in her office. From what I was told, the attack came on when she was alone in there with the door shut. She became so overwhelmed that she passed out before she could even reach the door handle to open it and get help. She collapsed inside, unseen and unable to call out. The only reason she was found at all was because someone from maintenance happened to notice a shadow against the bottom of her office door and stopped to investigate. That small detail still stays with me, because it means that if that person had not noticed that shadow, if they had not paused, if they had simply kept walking, things might have turned out much worse. Maintenance opened the door and found her there. A rescue squad was called, and she was taken to the nearest emergency room for treatment. When I heard all this on Monday, the words from the phone came rushing back into my mind so fast that it felt almost physical. Help her. Watch out for her. She will need you. I remember feeling cold all over. It was not just that something had happened to her. It was that I had been warned, more than once, and I had not understood what I was being told. I had heard the message repeatedly, and still had not known what to do with it. I did not know whether I should have tried to check on her more, whether I could have prevented something, or whether the calls were simply preparing me to understand after the fact that someone or something had been trying to speak. That alone would have been enough to leave me shaken. But the strangest part was still to come. Later that same Monday, I was in the media room listening to some old tapes of previously recorded seminars. There were boxes of them, and I was just going through them, probably not expecting anything more unusual than outdated business material and the droning voices people tend to use in seminars. Then I heard it. The voice. The exact voice from the calls. It was on one of the seminar tapes, calmly conducting the seminar. I froze when I recognized it. There was no uncertainty. It was the same female voice that had been coming through my office phone, saying the warning. Hearing it on the tape felt both shocking and strangely relieving because suddenly I knew I was not imagining the sound of the voice itself. It belonged to a real person, one whose voice had once been recorded. I needed to know who it was right away. So I asked another employee, someone who had been with the company a long time, whose voice I was hearing on the tape. The answer unsettled me more than I expected. I was told the voice belonged to a former administrative assistant who had died about 5 years earlier. I remember standing there with that information settling over me in layers. First the weird voice in the hall. Then the calls through my phone that did not ring but displayed the current administrative assistant's extension. Then the repeated warning. Then the asthma attack. And now the voice on the tape belonged to a woman who had once done the same kind of work and had been dead for 5 years. At that moment, bewildered does not even feel like a strong enough word. I felt as if the whole office had shifted around me. The rational explanations I had been trying to hold on to suddenly seemed small and weak. I went back to listening to the seminar tape because, honestly, I did not know what else to do. The only thing more disturbing than hearing the voice was pretending it meant nothing. When I finally left the media room, something happened that pushed the whole experience into another level entirely. As I was walking out, I turned and saw a woman standing there, smiling in my direction. She had short cropped brown hair. She wore glasses. She was dressed in a navy business suit. Her whole appearance had the neat, practical, professional look of someone who belonged in that office world, someone competent, calm, and at ease. She did not look frightening. She did not look distorted or ghostly in the exaggerated way people expect spirits to look in stories. She looked real, present, complete. She smiled at me and then went out through the opposite side door. For a moment, I simply accepted her presence because she fit the setting so naturally. But almost immediately afterward, the impossibility of it caught up with me. I had not seen anyone come in. I did not know who she was. And the whole media room experience had already put me in a state of heightened attention. A short time later, I went to return the seminar tapes. As I picked them up, I happened to look at the cover of one of them. There was a picture on it. It was her. The woman in the navy suit. The woman with the short brown hair and glasses. The woman who had just smiled at me in the media room. She was the former administrative assistant, the one who had taped the seminars, the one whose voice I had been hearing on my phone, the one who had been dead for 5 years. That was the moment when everything locked into place. Up until then, each event had still contained a little room for doubt. A strange voice in the office. A weird phone issue. A warning that made no sense until later. A familiar-sounding seminar voice. A woman glimpsed in the media room. But once I saw her image on that tape cover, there was no room left. I knew exactly who I had seen. And I knew that what had been trying to reach me had not been random, malicious, or meaningless. It had been purposeful. She had been trying to warn me about the current administrative assistant. And she had succeeded, in a way. I still think often about the fact that the calls always came through the current administrative assistant's extension. That detail feels important to me. It was almost as though the former administrative assistant, the one who had once held a similar place in the office and perhaps understood its rhythms better than anyone, chose the most direct route she could to identify who the warning was about. She used the living woman's line, or somehow attached herself to it, so I would know where to focus. She did not just drift a vague message through the air. She connected it to the exact person who would need help. At the time, of course, I did not understand. That is the part that still troubles me a little. I was hearing the warning, but I did not know what kind of danger was coming, when it would happen, or what I was supposed to do beyond asking the poor woman if she had tried to call me. I think that is what makes these kinds of experiences so difficult. Even when the message is clear in words, the meaning may still be unclear until events unfold. If I had known, would I have checked on her more? Would I have gone to her office the next time one of those calls came? Would I have looked in on her just to be safe? I cannot answer that now. All I know is that by the time I understood who had been speaking and why, the crisis had already happened. Still, there is comfort in something else. The former administrative assistant did not just warn for the sake of warning. She cared enough, from wherever she was, to reach through 5 years of death and office silence to say the same thing again and again until I would finally hear it. That says something to me about the nature of whatever comes after. If the dead were only echoes or empty impressions, would they care? Would they choose? Would they repeat a message with that kind of purpose? I do not think so. This felt personal. It felt intentional. It felt like one working woman looking out for another. There is something almost touching about that. Offices can be strange little worlds where people who are not family spend huge portions of their lives together. They share stress, deadlines, grief, laughter, illness, gossip, coffee, bad news, and ordinary routine. Bonds form in those places that outsiders often do not fully understand. Perhaps the former administrative assistant had loved that office. Perhaps she had cared deeply about the woman who later occupied a similar place in it. Or perhaps she simply could not bear to see another woman in that role collapse alone behind a closed door if she could do something to help. I also think about the way she appeared to me in the media room. She did not frighten me. She smiled. That detail matters. If she had wanted to terrify me, she could have appeared in some sudden or shocking way. Instead, she let me see her calmly, professionally, in a form that fit the place where she once belonged. She looked like herself, or at least like the version of herself still connected to her work and her identity in that building. In a strange way, it was almost as if she wanted me to recognize her, but only after I had already heard her voice and learned who she had been. She gave me the chance to put everything together in order, piece by piece, until the truth was undeniable but not cruel. Even the phrase she used stays with me. Help her. Watch out for her. She will need you. Those are not the words of something dark. Those are the words of concern. The words of someone trying to protect, prepare, and guide. There was urgency in them, yes, but not menace. Looking back, that tone matters almost as much as the words. The voice never sounded angry, mocking, or threatening. It sounded direct and serious, like someone with knowledge trying to pass it on. That is why, although the experience was deeply unsettling, I do not think of it as a frightening haunting in the usual sense. It was something else. It was a warning. A message. A dead woman reaching into the machinery of the living office world because there was still something she needed done. And she did it in the very system that defined that office world. Through the phone. Through the extension. Through the voice people would trust once they knew it belonged to someone real. That detail fascinates me too. Haunting stories often involve old houses, footsteps, cold rooms, shadows, and hallways. But this happened through business technology, through caller ID, through a modern office phone system. It is a reminder that the paranormal does not only linger around old furniture and creaky stairs. If something wants to communicate, maybe it will use whatever tools are available. In this case, it used a telephone system and a recorded voice. And then, after all that, it stepped out just long enough for me to see her in person. Sometimes I wonder if she knew I needed that final proof. Maybe she knew that without it, I would spend the rest of my life arguing with myself, wondering whether the stress of the office or the oddness of technology had gotten into my head. But by showing herself and then allowing me to find her image on the tape cover, she removed the last shelter of doubt. It was her. That is what I know now. The woman on the seminar tape. The voice on the calls. The figure in the media room. The former administrative assistant dead for 5 years. And ever since, I have never been able to think of that office in quite the same way again. It is still a building where people work, answer phones, fill out forms, pass in hallways, and leave at the end of the day. But now I also know that not everyone who cares about what happens there is necessarily alive. I sometimes think about that current administrative assistant too, and how close she came to something worse that day. If maintenance had not noticed the shadow under her door, she might have remained there alone much longer. If the rescue squad had come later, things could have turned out differently. Whether the warning helped directly or not, it prepared me to see the event for what it was and to understand afterward that she had not been as alone as she seemed. Someone had been watching. Someone had been trying to help. Someone had cared enough to say so. Even now, when I hear a strange office sound or glance at caller ID, a small part of me remembers those days. I remember the first voice drifting through the air in my office when no one was there. I remember the first time it came through the phone without a ring. I remember the screen showing the administrative assistant's name. I remember the calls repeating over days and weeks. I remember hearing she had collapsed. I remember hearing that same voice on the seminar tape, and then learning its owner had died years before. I remember the woman in the navy suit smiling at me in the media room. And I remember the tape cover with her photograph, waiting there quietly to confirm everything. Some people might call it coincidence stacked on coincidence. They can. I cannot stop them. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that one dead woman reached across 5 years to warn me that another woman would soon need help. That is not the kind of thing a person forgets. This happened in Michigan, in a graveyard where my mother and father were buried. I used to go there often in the mid-1980s. Some people might think that sounds strange, but for me it was never a frightening place in the beginning. It was a peaceful place. I always felt calm there, as if the noise of the world stopped at the gates and did not follow me inside. I would go there when I felt overwhelmed, when I had too much on my heart, or when life seemed heavy in a way I could not explain to anyone else. I would walk slowly among the graves, reading names, looking at dates, wondering about the people who had lived and died. Sometimes I looked for the oldest grave in the cemetery, and thought about how long that person had been resting there. Other times I looked at the newest graves and wondered if I knew the family, or if I had ever crossed paths with the person now buried there. A graveyard can teach you many things if you are the kind of person who walks through it with an open heart. It can teach you about time, grief, memory, and how quickly a life becomes a name carved in stone. Even though my mother and father were buried there, and I went there partly to feel close to them, I found myself drawn to all parts of that cemetery. I would move slowly, respectfully, and let my thoughts wander. I did not go there to frighten myself. I went because somehow it soothed me. That may sound strange to some people, but grief often makes you comfortable in places that other people avoid. A graveyard is a place where sorrow and peace somehow live side by side. I suppose that is why I felt all right there for such a long time. There was one part of the cemetery, though, that always touched me more deeply than the others. It was the section where the babies were buried. Every time I wandered there, I felt my heart sink. The graves were small, the dates painfully short, and the names seemed to carry a sadness larger than the stones themselves. I would think of those tiny innocent lives and feel tears rise before I could stop them. In my mind, I would think that the Lord must have taken those little ones to heaven to become angels, to help him in ways none of us on earth could understand. That thought was the only one that ever brought me any comfort in that section. Because otherwise, all I could think about was loss. A life only days old. A child never held long enough. A name that had barely had time to become part of the world before it was gone. One day, as I was walking among those baby graves, reading the names and dates and offering silent prayers in my heart, something happened that changed my life forever. I happened to step on one of the graves. The ground gave way under my foot, and down it went. Not deep enough to swallow my leg, but enough that I was suddenly up to just above my ankle. I was startled so badly that my whole body went stiff with fear. My first thought was that the grave had sunk into the ground and I had stepped into some weak place in the earth. I tried to pull my foot back out, but I could not. It would not come free. It was as though something had hold of me. I know how that sounds. Even now, after all these years, I know how it sounds. But that is exactly how it felt. It did not feel like my shoe was simply stuck in soft dirt or caught on a root. It felt like something was holding my leg. In that moment, my mind went wild. I looked down, half in terror, half in disbelief, almost expecting to see a tiny hand grasping me from beneath the ground. But there was nothing visible there. Just a hole, my foot in it, and the awful feeling that I was being held. My heart started pounding so hard and fast it felt like it would burst right out of my chest. I remember standing there frozen, trying to pull free, but also terrified to move too violently. I looked down at the grave and saw that it belonged to an infant who had died when just days old. I stood there trembling and said a prayer for that little angel. I do not even remember my exact words now, only the feeling. Fear, sorrow, and compassion all mixed together. The moment I finished the prayer, whatever had been holding my leg let go. I pulled my foot out and ran. I ran all the way back to my car as fast as I could and left that graveyard with my nerves shattered. As I drove away, I vowed that I would never return there again. I was too frightened, too shaken, and too confused to think any other way. For all the years that graveyard had brought me peace, in one terrible moment it had turned into something I no longer understood. For a few days I stayed away. But something would not let me leave that experience behind. At night, when I tried to sleep, my thoughts kept going back to that little grave. I would dream of the baby. I would wake up crying. In the daytime, I could not stop thinking about that child. It was as if the baby was calling to me, not in words, but in feeling. Deep inside, I began to believe that the baby had been trying to get my attention, not to frighten me, but because something was unfinished. Something was needed. I did not know what it was, and that not knowing ate at me. I could not rest. I would tell myself to forget it, to stay away, to leave the dead in peace. But the more I tried, the more strongly I felt pulled back. After a few days, I returned to the graveyard. I went straight to that same little grave. I do not know how to explain the feeling except to say that I could not stay away. I stood there and prayed again. I cried again. I left, only to feel compelled to come back once more. This happened several times. I would go to that grave, pray for that little baby, and leave. Then, later, I would be filled again with the feeling that I had not done enough. That the child still needed something from me. During the day, I could not stop thinking about that baby. It stayed in my mind constantly. I kept feeling that the child needed something, but I could not figure out what it could be. The grave had a headstone with the baby's name, birth date, and death date on it. It looked fairly new. The headstone also showed the name of the funeral home that had handled the burial. Eventually, the need to understand became too strong for me to ignore. I decided I had to do something that probably sounded ridiculous to any sensible person. I went to the funeral home. When I got there, I asked to speak to the director. I remember feeling embarrassed and unsure of myself, because I knew how strange my story would sound. When I finally sat down with him, I told him, "I know you're going to think I'm insane, but..." And then I told him everything. I told him about stepping into the grave, about feeling as though something had held my leg, about the dreams, about how I kept thinking of that baby, and about my deep feeling that the child needed me for some reason. To my surprise, he did not laugh. He did not brush me off or act as though I was out of my mind. Instead, he listened calmly, and then told me that what I had said did not surprise him. He said in his line of work he had seen, heard, and felt many things. That alone stayed with me. There was something comforting in the fact that he did not treat the spiritual world as foolishness. He told me he could not share information about the baby without permission from the parents, or at least from the mother. I told him I understood. He then said he would contact her and see what she said. Some time later, he called me back. He told me the mother did not mind if I knew what had happened to her baby, but she did not want her name shared. I told him that was fine. I asked when I could come, and later that same afternoon he met me at the grave. I brought flowers with me because the grave had none on it, and that had hurt me deeply each time I visited. A baby's grave with no flowers looked lonelier than I can describe. The funeral director stood beside me at the grave and told me the truth. He said the mother of the child had never wanted the baby. She had never even held the child in her arms. The baby had died of SIDS. The moment he said those words, my heart broke in a way that is difficult to put into language. Tears started pouring down my face so hard it felt like I would never stop crying. I looked down at that little grave and all I could think was that this child had come into the world and left it without ever being held by the mother whose body had given it life. No warmth. No comfort. No loving arms. No goodbye. I asked the funeral director to hold the flowers for me. Then I bent down toward the opening in the grave where my foot had once sunk through. In my mind, and in my heart, I reached down and lifted that baby out. I know some people will not understand that, but it was real to me. I did not physically disturb the grave, of course. But in my spirit, in my imagination, in that deep place where grief and love meet, I picked up that baby and held it in my arms. I cradled that child as though it were alive. I rocked gently. I sang softly. I told the baby that I loved it. I told it that it would not be forgotten. I told it that it could rest now. I kissed the baby I was holding in my mind and heart, and then I gently placed it back in its resting place. I took the flowers from the funeral director and laid them by the stone. He left after a while, but I stayed. I stood there crying and praying, asking God to let that child find peace at last. And then I felt something come over me unlike anything I had ever felt before. A calm. A deep, complete calm. It washed through me so fully that I knew, without anyone needing to tell me, that something had changed. I knew that the baby's spirit had felt love. I knew it had felt the tenderness of being held, maybe for the first time. I knew it understood it mattered to someone. While I still lived in that area, I brought flowers to that baby's grave at least once a month. Every time I went I prayed. I sang. Sometimes I bent down again in spirit and held the baby in my arms, rocking it and speaking softly. It may sound strange, but in my heart that child became mine in some way. Not as a mother in the earthly sense, but as a soul I had adopted through love. A child that had needed someone, and somehow I had been the one chosen to answer. After all of this, I went back with dirt from my own home and filled in the hole where my foot had once sunk through. In that spot, I planted a flower. It felt important to me to mend what had been broken there, not just in the ground, but in the story itself. A flower growing from that place seemed like a sign that something tender could come from sorrow. From then on, I went to the graveyard more often because of that baby. I would visit the grave, pray, sing, cry, and hold the child again in my heart. I would tell it that it was loved, that it mattered, that it was not alone and not forgotten. Each time I left, I felt a little peace, and I believe the baby did too. Eventually, life changed again, and I learned that I was going to relocate far away. Before I moved, I went back to that grave one more time to explain. I stood there with tears running down my face and told that baby that I would be moving away and would not be able to come back often. I promised that whenever I did return, I would still visit, still hold it in my heart, still sing and pray. I kissed the baby once more in my mind and left the graveyard with both sorrow and peace. Sorrow because I could not be there the way I had been. Peace because I knew the child's soul was finally at rest. For the first 7 years after I moved away, I kept my promise. Whenever I returned to that area, I went to the grave with flowers. I prayed. I sang. I told the child I still loved it. Then life dealt me another blow. I was in a bad car accident, and after that I could not drive long distances anymore. That made returning much harder. Even so, I have never forgotten that child. Not for one moment. I still think of the grave, the flowers, the songs, the prayers. And I still hope that perhaps this summer one of my children will drive me there so I can go once more, sing again, pray again, and tell that baby that after all these years, it is still loved. To me, the meaning of all this has always been clear. That baby's soul wanted to know that someone loved it. It wanted to be held. It wanted to feel tenderness and care. And once I showed that child love, once I cradled it and sang to it and prayed for it, the baby was able to rest. Some people might say it was all in my mind. Maybe they would say grief, imagination, compassion, and a troubled heart made me see meaning where there was none. But those people were not there. They did not feel what I felt when my foot went into that grave and would not come back out. They did not spend nights waking in tears with the child on their mind. They did not stand there at that grave and feel that deep peace arrive after an act of love. I know what happened to me. And I know what I believe. There are souls in this world, even tiny ones, who leave before they have had a chance to be welcomed properly. Some die too soon. Some leave unloved. Some leave without being held. I believe that little baby reached for me because it needed one human heart to say, "You mattered. You were loved. You were not forgotten." And I answered. That child, though it was not born to me, became part of my heart. Even now, writing about it, I feel the tears rise again. Not only tears of sadness, but tears of love. Because there are some souls you do not meet in ordinary ways. Some come to you through dreams, through grief, through strange moments in graveyards, and somehow they change you forever. That baby changed me. It taught me that even the smallest soul can cry out to be loved. It taught me that peace sometimes comes not through understanding everything, but through answering love with love. And it taught me that sometimes the dead do not need fear from the living. Sometimes they need tenderness. Sometimes they need a song. Sometimes they need flowers. Sometimes they need to be held, even if only in the heart of a stranger who is willing to listen. I recently went to Bozeman, Montana, to visit my brother and his fiancée. They were staying in a rented house while waiting for their new house to be finished, so this place was only meant to be temporary for them. Still, temporary homes can gather stories just as easily as permanent ones, and I learned that very quickly. When I first arrived, I was mostly thinking about the kind of visit it was supposed to be. I imagined a good family trip, some quality time together, maybe some great food, and the chance to enjoy the area. Bozeman itself felt beautiful and wide open in the way places out west often do. The air felt different there, colder and cleaner, and there was something calm about the landscape that made me think the visit would be peaceful. I had no reason to expect that the thing I would remember most from the trip would not be the mountains or the snow, but a man named Bill who may or may not have been dead. On the very first night I was there, just before we all went to bed, my brother and his fiancée warned me about the ghost in the house. The way they said it made it sound half serious and half playful, and I honestly thought they were joking. Families do that sometimes. You stay in an unfamiliar place, and someone decides to scare you a little before bedtime just for fun. I had always been somewhat skeptical when it came to the supernatural anyway. I was not the kind of person who completely denied that strange things happen, but I had a hard time believing that ghosts could really interact with us in a direct way. If people told me they felt something unusual, I could listen. If they told me a place had bad energy, I could understand that too. But full contact, full communication, a spirit standing there speaking to you clearly, that was a lot harder for me to accept. So when they mentioned the ghost, I laughed it off inwardly, even though I will admit that once bedtime came, their words stayed with me more than I wanted them to. That first night, I went up to bed feeling more uneasy than I expected. Even if you think something is just a joke, once the lights go low and the house grows quiet, your imagination becomes louder. I left the light on at first. I told myself it was silly, but still I left it on. That alone says something about how much their warning had gotten under my skin. I slept for a while like that, not deeply and not comfortably, and then I woke up sometime around 3 in the morning. The room looked different then, the way rooms always do in the middle of the night when your eyes open into silence. Everything feels flatter and stranger. The familiar becomes slightly unfamiliar. For a while, I just lay there thinking about how ridiculous it was to keep the light on because of some comment made before bed. I told myself I was acting like a child. So I reached over and turned the light off. The moment the room went dark, I regretted it a little. Not because anything happened right away, but because the darkness felt complete. I was in an upstairs bedroom, alone on that floor, and the silence after I turned the light off felt deeper than it should have. I tried to settle myself and go back to sleep. I turned from one side to the other. I adjusted the blankets. I closed my eyes and opened them again. Sleep would not come. Eventually, after enough restless movement, I ended up on my back staring at the ceiling. It was one of those moments where you are tired enough to want sleep badly but alert enough that your mind will not let go. Then everything changed. Within moments, I heard a low tone. It was not a loud noise. It was more like the kind of sound you hear when someone turns on an electrical switch, or when an old radio is powered up and begins to hum before anything else comes through. It had that strange electronic quality, low and steady, and it seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It did not sound like it was happening in another room. It felt very close. Almost inside the room itself, inside the air around me. Before I had time to properly understand what I was hearing, my whole body became overwhelmed with vibrations. That part is hard to describe if you have never felt anything like it. The vibrations were not just a little trembling, or the ordinary shaking that comes from fear. They moved from my head to my feet, and then seemed to travel up and down again and again. My entire body felt caught in them. It was as if I had become part of some current running through the bed, the room, and my own body all at once. It was not painful exactly, but it was intense and completely beyond anything I had ever experienced. I could feel it everywhere. I was aware of my own body, very aware, but I was also aware that I was not in control of what was happening to it. At first, along with the low tone and the vibrations, I heard a man's voice. It was not clear at first. It sounded like incoherent mumbling, like someone speaking just beyond the edge of understanding. I could tell it was a male voice, but I could not make out the words. I remember trying to stay calm and thinking, almost instinctively, that maybe if I answered, whatever was happening would make more sense. So I tried to say, "Okay." I wanted to say it clearly, as if to show that I was willing to listen, willing to hear what the presence had to say. But nothing came out the way I intended. All that escaped me was air and some kind of weak, broken sound that did not resemble a real word. It was one of the strangest feelings I have ever had, to know exactly what I wanted to say and to feel my mouth fail me. I kept trying. I tried again to say, "Okay." Then I thought maybe I should ask a question, something simple and direct. So I tried to ask, "What are you doing here?" Again, the same thing happened. I could not make the words properly. All that came out were little gasps, grunts, and broken attempts at speech. I remember feeling frustrated even in the middle of my fear, because I was trying so hard to communicate, and my body would not cooperate. I do not know whether I was physically frozen in the full sense of the word or only partly able to move, but I know that speaking felt almost impossible. I was aware of myself, aware of the room, aware of trying, and aware of failing. Then I saw him. What followed still gives me chills every time I think about it. After I tried to speak, I saw the appearance of a man standing at the side of my bed, down near my feet. He was not some vague shape or dark blur. He had form. He had a body. He looked like an actual person standing there, though not fully in the way a living person would look in normal light. He was wearing a button-down shirt tucked into pants, and he had his hands in his pockets. That detail struck me strongly because it made him seem so ordinary, so casual, as if he had not come there dramatically at all, but had simply been standing there in a familiar posture. I could see his face too. He looked like a man in his 60s, with little or no hair. His face did not seem monstrous or distorted. It looked like a normal older man's face. What was strange was the clarity of it in the middle of everything else. I was in bed, vibrating, unable to speak properly, hearing this low electrical tone, and yet the image of him felt steady. Then he spoke in a clear voice and said, "Well, I was just up here, so..." And that was it. Those words have stayed with me because of how oddly ordinary they sounded. He did not introduce himself in a dramatic way. He did not threaten me. He did not speak in some ancient or ghostly style. He sounded almost casual, like a man responding to a simple question. I had tried to ask what he was doing there, and that was his answer. He was just up there. That was all. But the normal tone of it somehow made the whole thing more disturbing, not less. There was no wild horror in his voice, just presence, as if his being there required no explanation beyond the one he had given. One strange detail that I remember very clearly is that when he spoke, his lips seemed slightly more illuminated than the rest of him. It was not like the room lit up fully. It was just that I could see the movement of his mouth with more clarity than the rest of his form. It drew my attention in a way that made the speech feel even more real. It was not like hearing a voice and attaching it to a shape. It was like seeing and hearing him together in one complete moment. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. He was gone. The vibration stopped. The tone stopped. And I was left lying there, awake, stunned, and full of a fear I could not quite fit into any normal category. At the time, I had no doubt that I had been awake. That is important to say because ever since then, like many people who have experiences that sound impossible, I have gone back and tried to test my own memory against reason. I have read about sleep paralysis since then. I know what people say about it. I know that people can wake up unable to move, hear sounds, feel vibrations, sense presences, and even see vivid figures in the room. I understand all of that. And after reading those explanations, I did begin to question myself. Was I really fully awake? Had I experienced some extreme form of sleep paralysis? Was my brain trapped between sleep and wakefulness and generating the whole thing? But here is the problem with that explanation for me. Before I read about sleep paralysis, I had absolutely no doubt in my own mind that I was awake and fully aware. I remember the physical feeling of my body too strongly. I remember my attempts to speak. I remember the frustration of trying to form words. I remember the image of the man in a way that felt nothing like a dream or a half-thought. The experience was so physical, so overwhelming, and so sharply real that even now I struggle to believe it can be explained away so neatly as a sleep event. Maybe there is a scientific explanation, maybe there is not, but whatever happened to me did not feel like simple sleep to me. It felt like an encounter. The next morning, I told my brother and his fiancée what had happened. I expected some reaction, but I was not prepared for how quickly they connected my experience to their own. Instead of looking at me like I was crazy or overreacting, they began telling me about similar things that had already happened to them in that same house. My brother's fiancée said that about a week earlier, she had heard a man's voice say, "This is Bill?" She had also experienced the same vibrating and frozen feeling I described. That alone was enough to unsettle me badly, because it meant I had not experienced something entirely in isolation. The strange bodily sensations, the voice, the inability to move or speak properly, all of it had already happened to someone else in the house. And there was more. They told me that their bed had been vibrating, not just once or twice, but at all times of the day, before my visit, during my stay, and even afterward. That detail is one I still think about often, because it means the house was active in a physical way that was not limited to the middle of the night or one frightened guest in an upstairs bedroom. Their bed itself had continued to vibrate on and off, as if something unseen was attached to that space. That moved the story even farther away from the category of one strange sleep experience, and into something ongoing, something shared, something embedded in the place itself. My brother's fiancée also told me about another experience she had, one that was just as disturbing in its own way. One night, while she was again incapacitated and struggling to speak, she heard a woman's voice say, "Look at her lips," referring to the trembling of her mouth as she tried to get words out. That detail made the whole thing feel even more layered. It was not only one male presence. There were others. Or at least other voices. And they were aware enough of what she was going through to comment on it. By that point, the whole visit had changed shape completely. What had started as a trip I expected to be about snowboarding, good meals, and catching up with family turned into something else entirely. Instead of planning mountain activities and enjoying a simple visit, we ended up talking about Bill and whatever companions might also be in the house. That became the center of my time there. Every room felt different after that. Every silence carried more meaning. The house no longer felt like just a temporary rental where my brother and his fiancée were waiting for construction on their new place to finish. It felt occupied in a way that went beyond furniture and human routine. I found myself thinking about the man I saw over and over again. Who was he really? Was he Bill? Was he someone who had once lived there? Was he attached to the house itself, or to the land, or to one of the people in it? And what did he mean by saying, "Well, I was just up here, so..." That sentence keeps returning to me because it was so unfinished, as if I had interrupted him in the middle of something. It was not a message meant to impress or frighten. It was more like a matter-of-fact explanation from someone who did not feel he had to justify being in that room. It sounded almost like he belonged there. That made me uncomfortable in a very deep way. Because if a spirit says it is just up there, what does that mean for the living person trying to sleep in the bed? What also stayed with me was how ordinary he looked. If he had looked obviously monstrous or strange, perhaps my mind would have filed him away more easily as a nightmare or a symbolic image. But he looked like a real man. An older man. One who might once have worn that kind of button-down shirt, tucked it into his pants, and stood casually with his hands in his pockets. He looked like someone who had lived a normal life. That ordinary quality made him more disturbing, because it blurred the line between the dead and the living in a way that still troubles me. He did not look like a ghost should look according to stories. He looked like a person standing in the room, except he was not alive. I also think often about the timing. Why did it happen after I turned the light off? Why did I wake around 3? Why was I unable to sleep even before it began? There are those who would say those details support the sleep paralysis explanation, and perhaps they do. But there is something about the total experience, especially when placed next to what my brother and his fiancée had already gone through, that makes me hesitate to settle fully into that comfort. It is easier in some ways to say it was all sleep paralysis, all bodily stress, all suggestion. But once you start adding their vibrating bed, their voices, their own inability to move and speak, the picture becomes less simple. That is why, whatever the exact explanation may be, I am not a skeptic anymore. Something happened in that house. Whether science can someday explain all of it in a way that satisfies every detail, or not, I know that the experience changed me. Before that trip, I could hold on to distance. I could hear stories and think they were interesting, but still keep one foot firmly planted in doubt. After that trip, after that night, after seeing that man and hearing his answer, after learning that I was not alone in what I had experienced, doubt stopped feeling like the safest place to stand. I still think carefully about things. I do not run around believing every creak or shadow is a ghost. But I no longer dismiss people so easily when they talk about contact with something beyond ordinary life. Because I had contact. Or at least something had contact with me. And once that happens, once you feel your body taken over by vibrations and hear a voice in the dark and see a man standing by your bed speaking as plainly as any living person might speak, it becomes impossible to return to the neat comfort of disbelief. The rest of that trip passed under the shadow of that night. Even when we tried to do ordinary things, there was always this unspoken awareness in the background. We might sit and eat, talk, make plans, or laugh at something else, but then the conversation would drift back to Bill. To the vibrating bed. To the voice saying, this is Bill? To the woman's voice telling someone to look at trembling lips. To the way my brother and his fiancée had tried to live in that house while strange things kept making themselves known. And perhaps the strangest part of all was how calm some of the voices sounded. None of what was said felt like the dramatic language of horror movies. It was simple. Almost conversational. Well, I was just up here, so, this is Bill. Look at her lips. Those are not grand messages. They are small, almost casual statements. That everyday quality made the experiences more unsettling, not less. It was as if the dead, if that is what they were, did not see their own presence as extraordinary at all. They were just there, speaking from their side into ours. Even now, when I think of Bozeman, Montana, I do not first think of the mountains or the snow. I think of that room. I think of waking at 3 in the morning. I think of the darkness after I shut off the light. I think of the low electrical tone. I think of the vibrations climbing and falling through my body. I think of trying so hard to say one simple word and failing. And I think of the man standing by my bed near my feet, with his hands in his pockets, looking like an ordinary older man and saying, in that plain voice, that he was just up there. That memory has never softened. It still gives me chills because it still feels physically close, as though if I shut my eyes and remember too hard, I could feel the vibration start again. That is one reason I cannot simply explain it away and forget it. My body remembers it as much as my mind does. And maybe that is why the experience changed me so completely. Because some things, once felt, cannot be unfelt. Some doors, once opened, do not close again in the same way. I went to Montana thinking I was visiting family in a rented house while waiting for their new home to be built. I left feeling as though I had stepped for a moment into a place where the dead still speak, where beds vibrate with unseen presence, and where skepticism no longer feels like a safe or honest position to hide behind. What happened in that house may always sit somewhere between the supernatural and the scientific. But for me, in the deepest part of myself, the conclusion is simple. I met something there. Maybe it was Bill. Maybe it was someone else entirely. But whatever it was real enough to change me forever. In the summer of 2004, my husband, my 2-year-old daughter, and I moved from Wyoming to Pocatello, Idaho. At the time, the move felt like one of those big life changes that should have brought a fresh start. New place, new routines, new surroundings, and the hope that things would settle into something better. We were still young, still building our life together, and like many families, we were doing the best we could with what we had. The place we moved into was not a modern apartment complex or some shiny new building. It was actually an old house that had been built sometime in the 1920s and later divided into 3 separate apartments. There was something charming about it at first. Old houses often carry that kind of feeling. They have character, little details newer places do not have. and an atmosphere that can seem warm and interesting when you first walk in. We ended up in the downstairs apartment on the left-hand side. It was not perfect, but it was home, at least for a while. In the beginning, nothing seemed obviously wrong. We moved in, unpacked our things, found places for our furniture, and started trying to make the apartment feel like our own. That is what people always do when they move. You place your belongings around you like little anchors and hope the place starts to soften and accept you. My daughter was only 2, so keeping some kind of routine for her mattered a lot. I was busy with all the normal things that come with settling into a new home: kitchen stuff, laundry, arranging the living room, figuring out what cabinet would hold what, deciding where books and towels and shoes should go. My husband, being the practical and level-headed person he always was, focused on the ordinary side of things too. If something needed fixing, he looked at it. If something seemed odd, he looked for the most reasonable explanation first. That was his nature. Mine was different. I have always had a fascination with the paranormal. Ever since I was young, I was the kind of person who did not dismiss strange feelings too easily. I was not reckless about it, and I did not go around calling every creak in the floorboards a ghost. But I have always believed there are things in this world that do not fit neatly into what we can explain. My husband, on the other hand, was about as practical as a person can be. If something strange happened, his first thought was always that there must be a simple reason, and 9 times out of 10 he believed that was enough. In some ways, that balance between us was good. It kept me from drifting too far into imagination, and it kept him from becoming completely blind to unusual things. But in that apartment, for the first time, his practical explanations slowly started running out. The strange things began only a few weeks after we moved in. At first, they were the kind of things people can explain away without too much trouble if they want to. Little things. Small things. The sort of things that are easy to laugh off or blame on stress, distraction, or the confusion of settling into a new place. Objects would disappear for no clear reason, and then reappear exactly where I had left them. That was one of the earliest patterns I noticed. I would set something down, know exactly where I put it, go back for it later, and it would be gone. I would search for it, get frustrated, and then after a while it would turn up in the exact place where I had first looked. Not somewhere nearby. Not behind something. In the same place. It happened too often to feel like simple forgetfulness. But still, in those early days, it was easy enough to tell myself that moving had made me scattered or tired. There were also noises. Most of the noises happened at night, and I noticed them more because nighttime makes every house sound different. During the day, noises blend into life. At night they stand apart. In our apartment, one of the strangest sounds I heard was children laughing and running around in the upstairs apartment. At first that may not sound unusual. People live upstairs, after all. People walk around, drop things, talk, and laugh. But the problem was that I knew for a fact the woman living above us did not have children. She did not have visitors very often either, and when she did, they were not noisy enough to sound like kids running through the apartment. More importantly, many times when I heard those sounds, she was not even home. That detail bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I would hear little feet, quick movement, and the sound of children laughing in that old building, and there was no logical reason for it. Because of my interest in paranormal things, it was not difficult for me to believe that spirits could be behind those sounds. My husband, however, was not interested in hearing that explanation. He would insist there had to be a normal cause. Maybe sound traveled strangely through the building. Maybe neighbors nearby had children playing outside. Maybe I had mistaken some other noise for laughter. He always had a reason. At first I let him have those reasons because, honestly, I wanted them too. It is easier to live in a place if you can believe the strange things are only misunderstandings. But the apartment had its own way of pushing beyond that comfort. A few months later, my husband saw the first thing he could not explain away. By that time, one particular strange activity had become common enough to really frustrate us. We would come home and find that an entire roll of toilet paper had been unraveled from the holder and spread all over the bathroom floor. The first few times it happened, my husband blamed our dog. That was the easiest explanation, and at first I could understand why he wanted to believe it. Except there was one major problem. Our dog was a 5-pound Chihuahua. Tiny. So tiny that there was no realistic way she could reach the toilet paper roll to spin it all the way down on her own. Even if she had somehow managed to jump or pull at it once or twice, the way the paper was completely unwound and lying all over the floor did not fit what she was capable of doing. This went on for a while, and every time it happened, it irritated us more. It is amazing how something as silly as toilet paper can become unsettling once it keeps happening for no reason. The fact that no scientific or practical explanation seemed to fit it made it worse. And then one day, my husband finally saw it happen with his own eyes. He was standing in the bathroom shaving. No one else was in there with him. He was right there, facing the mirror, doing something completely normal, when the toilet paper roll began to spin on its own. He watched it happen. He saw the roll turning and turning while the paper came off and piled on the floor. He was stunned. That was the first time I think he truly allowed himself to think maybe I was right. Maybe there was something in the apartment we were not understanding. After that, we began to suspect that at least one of the spirits in our home might be a mischievous child. That idea seemed to fit the laughter in the upstairs apartment, the running sounds, and the silly but annoying trick with the toilet paper. The child theory only seemed more likely after a friend of ours, Samantha, came over one day with an acquaintance who happened to be psychic sensitive. This person had never been in our apartment before and had no knowledge of any of the strange things that had been happening there. We had not told him stories beforehand or given him anything to build on. Yet not long after entering the apartment, he told me he saw a little girl standing in the corner of our living room. He said she had dark hair and was wearing a frilly blue dress. That description stayed with me strongly because it sounded so specific and so old-fashioned. He did not say he had a bad feeling. He did not just say he sensed something. He said he saw a little girl. He was visibly unnerved by it too. In fact, he seemed so uncomfortable that he wanted to leave not long after telling us. That reaction mattered to me. It did not feel like someone performing for attention. It felt like someone who saw something he had not expected to see and did not want to stay around it any longer than necessary. I never actually saw a clear visual apparition of the child myself. I wish I could say I did, because it would make the whole story feel easier to pin down in memory, but my own experiences were different. I felt the child presence many times. I sensed it. Sometimes I knew something was there in the room with me even when I could not see it. There is a difference between a bad feeling and a presence, and I learned that in that apartment. A presence feels almost personal. It feels like attention turned toward you. The child's spirit did not seem especially harmful, though. For the most part, it only made itself known through mischief and small disturbances. Strange enough to unsettle us, but not dark in a heavy way. Unfortunately, that was not the only presence in the house. There was something else there too. That second presence felt very different from the little girl. From the beginning, I sensed it as male, and unlike the child presence, it did not feel playful or harmless. It did not bother everyone the same way either. In fact, it seemed to focus on me. That was one of the most disturbing parts. It always chose moments when my husband was not in the room. It was as if whatever it was understood when I was alone and preferred it that way. That made every experience with it feel more personal and more threatening. One night stands out more clearly than all the others. I was in bed, half asleep, in that drowsy state where you are still aware of the house but beginning to drift. My husband was in the living room playing video games, and I remember feeling fairly safe because I knew he was nearby. My eyes were closed, and I was not trying to stay awake. Then I heard something that made me snap into attention almost instantly. I heard heavy footsteps moving through the kitchen. Not light sounds. Not old house creaks. Heavy footsteps, the kind that clearly belonged to an adult. I listened as they crossed through the kitchen and stopped right at the doorway of our bedroom. Then I heard my husband's voice say my name. Naturally, I answered, "What?" I did not open my eyes at first because I assumed it was really him. Why would I think otherwise? He was in the apartment. I had heard footsteps. I had heard his voice. It all fit into a normal pattern. But then nothing answered me back. That made me open my eyes. I rolled over, sat up, and looked toward the doorway. There was no person standing there. No husband. No one at all in the ordinary sense. But there was something. Even in the darkness, I could make out a shadowy form leaning or standing near the doorway. It was not just a patch of darkness. It was a shape. The moment I saw it, I knew with absolute certainty that it was not my husband. I became frightened right away. There was no confusion in me once I looked properly. Whatever stood there had used his voice to get my attention. I told it to go away and leave me alone. The moment I did that, it vanished. Just like that. I jumped up and ran into the living room. My husband was sitting on the couch exactly where he had been all along, playing his game. He had not been in the kitchen. He had not walked to the bedroom door. He had not called my name. He also had not heard anything unusual, but he saw how scared I was and, to his credit, did not try to laugh it off or tell me I had only imagined it. Something about the fear in me must have convinced him that I had experienced something very real to me. What disturbed me most about that incident was not only the shadow form itself, but the fact that it knew my name and had used my husband's voice. It felt deceptive, almost manipulative, as if it were trying to trick me into lowering my guard. That detail bothered me for a long time afterward. A friend later suggested maybe it had been my spirit guide, but I rejected that immediately. Whatever that presence was, it did not feel kind or protective to me. It did not carry any warmth or guidance. It felt wrong. It felt like something that wanted me uneasy. That was when I seriously began thinking that we needed to find another place to live. Once we did find another suitable apartment, we started packing. That was when things became more intense. It felt as if the spirits in that house knew we were leaving and did not like it. I know how that sounds, but that is honestly how it felt. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted. There was tension in it, almost like the house itself had become irritated. We tried to keep working, tried to focus on boxes and tape and sorting our belongings. But underneath all of that practical work was the unmistakable feeling that we were no longer welcome to simply leave peacefully. On the final day we lived there, I was in the living room packing up my books. Books take longer than people think because you cannot just toss them in carelessly. I was focused on that task, kneeling or bending over boxes, when suddenly a curtain rod was ripped loose from the wall and came flying down straight toward my head. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. Luckily, I was not hit. But I easily could have been. The curtain rod did not simply slip and fall neatly to the floor. It came down with force, and the screw that had fastened it to the wall was still sticking out of it. That meant it could have seriously hurt me if it had landed differently. After it happened, my husband looked at both the rod and the hole in the wall and confirmed what I already suspected. It had not just worked itself loose over time and fallen. It had been pulled out of the wall. That was the final sign we needed. We finished packing as quickly as we could and got out of there. We did not linger. We did not argue with ourselves anymore about whether there might be some rational answer hidden behind everything. By that point, we had lived through too much for that comfort to hold. Still, before we left, I said a prayer for the spirits we were leaving behind. I did not do that because I suddenly felt affectionate toward them, especially not toward the darker male presence. I did it because whatever those beings were, they had once been something more than shadows and strange sounds. And perhaps, in some way I could not understand, they were trapped, or restless, or bound to that old divided house in ways none of us could see. After we left, I never stopped thinking about that apartment. It stayed in my memory because it challenged both of us in different ways. For me, it confirmed that the paranormal is not always distant or dramatic. Sometimes it enters your daily life through missing objects, children laughing where there are no children, or a toilet paper roll spinning on its own in a quiet bathroom. And then, slowly, it reveals darker layers. A child's spirit in a frilly blue dress standing in the living room corner. A heavier male presence standing in the bedroom doorway using your husband's voice. A curtain rod coming loose with force on the very day you are trying to leave. For my husband, I think that apartment changed something too. He never lost his practical nature, but after living through all that, he could no longer insist with complete confidence that there was always a simple explanation for everything. There are only so many times you can explain away the impossible before the explanation itself becomes the more unreasonable thing. Even now, when I think of that old 1920s house divided into 3 apartments, I wonder how much history had gathered inside it before we ever arrived. Who had lived there before? Had other families heard the laughter of unseen children? Had anyone else fought with the toilet paper in that bathroom? Had anyone else felt watched in the bedroom when they were alone? Had anyone else tried to leave and felt something resist? Old houses hold layers. Walls absorb life. And sometimes, maybe, they hold on to more than just memory. I also still think about that little girl the psychic sensitive man described. The dark hair. The frilly blue dress. The corner of the living room. There was something so specific and old-fashioned about her that it felt almost like a memory from another time had become stuck there. If she really was one of the spirits in the apartment, then I do not think she meant us any serious harm. She felt mischievous, childlike, and perhaps lonely. I wonder sometimes if she had once lived in that house before it was split into apartments, back when it was still a single-family home. Maybe the laughter upstairs belonged to her. Maybe the running sounds did too. Maybe the toilet paper rolling onto the floor was her way of reminding us she was there. The male presence, though, is the one that left the deepest mark on me. It was the one that made me feel unsafe. It was the one that used deception. It was the one that appeared only when my husband was absent. And it was the one that convinced me most clearly that not every spirit in a haunted place is harmless or friendly. In the years since, I have thought often about how easily some people brush off stories like this. They say old pipes, settling wood, tired minds, stress, and imagination. And sometimes, yes, some strange things do have ordinary explanations. But not everything does. Some things resist logic because they do not belong fully inside it. That apartment was like that. A place where the ordinary and the unexplainable sat side by side until eventually you had to admit that the unexplainable was winning. And the truth is, I still feel grateful that we left when we did. Because there are places where you can coexist with strangeness for a while, and then there are places where the strangeness begins to push back harder the longer you stay. Our apartment had reached that point by the end. The spirits had started with little things, then moved to stronger manifestations, and finally ended with an object coming loose violently enough to hurt me. That progression matters. It makes me think that if we had stayed longer, something worse might have happened. So in the end, we left not only with our belongings, but with a deeper understanding that some places carry more than dust, age, and old plumbing. Some places carry the dead. Some carry children who laugh in empty rooms. Some carry men who stand in dark doorways and use voices that are not their own. And some do not want to let the living go easily once they have settled in. That apartment in Pocatello was one of those places. And I have never forgotten it.